Good morning. Hi, Jeff. How you doing?
Hey Ben, I'm doing well. How are
Are
you?
you? I'm good. Are you quote unquote ready for this session?
I am ready, pumped, and excited to talk about landing zone.
Good, good. Why did I call this why was I so enthusiastic about being ready? What do you think the reason there is?
Probably because you're ready to talk about the cloud adoption framework's ready methodology.
You're correct. Yes. All right. So let's get into it. Let me first give a little recap of what we talked about last week because last Wednesday, because what we did that at that point is basically set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. So last week was about getting started with the cloud adoption framework. And what you get there basically is the ability to one kind of get your house in order, kind of understand what are some of the main modules that you would want to go do, kind of get a sense for what is the most important things to think about when it comes to adopting the cloud. And then we decided, okay, let's jump right in and talk about the landing zone. And so today, that's really what we're going to go do is we're going to go deep. This is a pretty technical session, so let's jump right in and fasten the seatbelts. So we have a great moderator on the chat here. Megan has been will be there to answer any of your questions that come through. She'll send the questions to us if she needs to, and we'll get to those questions as we go throughout the session here. So I think with that, let's dive in. One more thing. So so one of the important aspects of a Learn Live session is that this is associated with a Learn Live module. So the Learn Live module for this particular session is going to relate specifically to choosing your landing zone. So choose the best landing zone to support your requirements for cloud operations. That is a really, really good module. It takes about an hour and a half. I actually think you could. I spent actually quite a bit more time kind of reading through this module to get a sense for it because there is so much content here, a lot of really good nuances, and it goes much deeper into the customer narrative, which is Tailwind Traders, and all the different issues that Tailwind Traders has when it comes to making decisions about what they want to do with their landing zone. I'll get into that in a second. But I think what's also really important is, Jeff, you're kind of one of the originators of this Learn Live session, and you actually helped develop a lot of the landing zone concepts. So great to have you here.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about how our customers are using platform and application landing zones today, and to have a conversation with those who have joined us right along in this journey.
Yeah. As we jump into this, why was this particular methodology called Ready? Why did we go there in the first place?
It's a great question. I think the goal was to ensure that our customers knew this is the place where you get ready to adopt the platform, where you are understanding what are the requirements for the Azure platform for your business. What are your motivations have already been worked out in strategy in the Cloud Adoption Framework strategy methodology. You've made a plan, so you've identified the people and the applications in your portfolio that you're looking to work with in the plan section of the Cloud Adoption Framework. And now it's time to get ready. It's time to ensure that the configurations, the controls that you place on the platform of Azure is ready for you to start migrating and adopting the cloud, right? So the emphasis on ready, we'll say nomenclature, was to indicate, hey, now it's time to get ready to prepare your platform for applications and for workloads.
All right, and I think another really important point that you're making is we're getting ready to help you optimize your experience on Azure, and that basically means a variety of things. But we'll go deeper into management, governance, and security of and the requirements for operating in the cloud. And of course, we're going to talk about common operating models. That's a really important area. I think one of those areas that a lot of organizations don't spend enough time on, there's a variety of reasons for that, and most of it's because they dive right into implementing and operating in the cloud. Like they adopt something and they move forward. But so often we talk to customers who wish they had stepped back and really thought about how would their operations change if they were to have all this new fluidity and agility in the cloud and really observability. So there's a lot of things that go on when you move to the cloud that will effectively change the way you operate. And so I think we'll have some really good conversation here about that as well. Of course, evaluating your options when you look at implementing your landing zones. I think Jeff, you were going to do a demo for us today too on how to do that. So that's going to be awesome. And then finally, choosing the best landing zone and how to think about using the Learn modules to support you as you go. We're going to talk mainly about Ready, but there's some aspects to Ready that will basically get into things like governance, management, security. But there are methodologies for each one of these, and so you can go much deeper in understanding how to operate in your ongoing operations, how to think about governance in a more detailed manner, and then security. There's an entire methodology on security alone. So, in fact, there's really interesting ties between the Ready methodology, where we talk about baselines, and how to enhance those baselines with some of these functions. So, yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about, well, actually, Jeff, if you wouldn't mind kind of giving an introduction as to how we think about the cloud, like how do we start some of these early platform decisions?
Yeah, I think every customer is looking at the cloud for ways that they could optimize business outcomes, right? And I think that's where we drive the strategy for customers who are looking to migrate or even re-platform and adopt platform as a service or software as a service solutions is the idea that we can deliver the same business value or greater business value by utilizing the services that are available in the cloud. So the first journey is the first part of the journey is to really understand why you're adopting the cloud and what are the incentives for doing so, right? And many times we're talking about ease of management. We're also talking about infinite scale and agility when it comes to new features, new functionality that'll be invested in. You know, the sort of legacy IT approach is that we buy hardware, we adopt hardware, we have to go through a procurement process and change management with that hardware, and we have to own the life cycle of that hardware. The cloud changes that paradigm where now we own the life cycle of the value that application is providing, right? And so this gives us the ability to plan for the life cycle of the service and also know that the functions and features of that are needed for the business in order to deliver value to our stakeholders and value to our organization is driven by this innovation of what outcomes we can drive with IT. So it's really this cloud adoption process starts with understanding the strategy, right, and making a plan. And these are kind of the early platform decisions. One of those has to do with how your business and your organization is going to align to cloud functions, right? So whether it be someone within the company who's the cloud engineer or cloud architect who manages the cloud adoption process, there could also be a cloud enablement team. And so that enablement team is almost like an interface between product teams and a platform engineering team to ensure that requirements are met by the business as the cloud is being adopted, and the application teams get the versatility and the function that they need from the cloud as they adopt it that aligns to the organization's compliance requirements. So those are some of the early stages where we need to make sure, number one, how are we going to function in the cloud and what is the business value as we do so? And then two, we move to okay, what does innovation look like in the value streams of our delivery team? So with our application DevOps teams, with our platform teams that are developing platforms for application teams, are we all aligned in value stream to deliver features and functionality to our stakeholders for our applications and to the business on a iterative basis, right? And so those are the things; those are the top things that I think about whenever I think about the beginning of a customer's cloud journey.
Yeah, and how much time do you typically spend on those early stages, like when you're talking to the customer about what their expectations are and how are they planning to move forward with those?
Yeah, typically time wise, it really has to do with the priority that the business has with the business impact that is going to be driven by cloud adoption, right? So sometimes we have triggers that happen in business. Say, hey, we want to be out of a certain data center by a certain date because we don't want to keep that footprint and the costs that come with managing that physical location. Sometimes the triggers are have to do with incentives from licensing. So maybe you have a particular application or a particular life cycle for an application that you're managing that is coming to an end. And so you say, hey, let me move that to the cloud because I need to update my licensing model and I need to maintain this application. So you get some advantages, right, from moving to the cloud to get some either extended functionality or extended support. Another key trigger is around the desire to innovate. When customers are looking, like in today's world with big data or even AI, and you want to move to the cloud in order to drive that innovation within your business, you need to have the data kind of close to each other and you want to be able to iterate really quickly on that application. And so there's many triggers for organizations as far as how quickly they execute. But at the end of, once we get past the justification for the investment that's going to be made, that typically can take, for a small organization, a half a day, a day. For a larger organization, it can take up to a month
Mhm.
or a month and a half to really assess the full estate, data estate, and application dependency map, those kind of things in order to move things to the cloud. So it's based on how resilient and how versatile the IT manager can be to identify the requirements, what success looks like within the business. We have many tools to help do that. So if it's just as simple as migrating some virtual machines to the cloud, we have like the Azure Migrate service that allows you to assess those services. But if at the end of the day, the I think a really important construct is being ready to migrate those applications onto the Azure platform. Having those default configurations on the platform that ensure baselines, like you were speaking about earlier, for security, for governance, for identity, and for networking. Those are the three places I would say that take the longest time. Ben, just thinking about your question there around amount of time. Really, security, identity, and networking are where most customers are going to spend the most planning hours in getting their Azure platform ready to move workloads to and applications to. So if you can get those three teams engaged early and often, security and identity and networking, you're going to have a very smooth adoption, as well as you'll have all your requirements and compliance needs established up front.
All right, that's a great answer. Thank you. Let's go on to the next slide and see what beholds. Yes. So let's talk a bit about the customer narrative that kind of makes up the module here. So this is the same Tailwind Traders customer narrative that was used in the previous session where we were talking about getting started. So one of the things about Tailwind Traders is they're a relatively large organization. They have about 3,500 people. They have about 100 people in their IT teams, and they're all dedicated to these IT teams, and they're centrally managed, or centrally operated. So one of the aspects to that is they have three data centers. Two of the data centers are relatively new, and the third one is kind of was part of an acquisition. And they actually want to move out of all three of those data centers and move all to the cloud. In fact, one of the data centers they're already closing just as we speak, like literally. So they're not ready, but they're ready and they're moving forward. The other two are data centers that are being basically their leases run up. So as you were saying earlier, that's a major trigger for a lot of customers is to move out of a data center because of a lease or something along those lines. So that's effectively what's happening here in the Tailwind Traders scenario. The other really interesting area here is they have two types of workloads. One is called boundless commerce, and the other is analytics, AI, and robotics. These two types of workloads are the first one is basically where they go about innovating for direct customer interaction. So this is kind of their retail presence. And so they spend a lot of time thinking about performance here. They think a lot about what are some of the key features and that they want to innovate for the purpose of customer experience. On the other hand, they also have a lot of back-end systems where they're building in analytics and AI and robotics, basically to make it easier to deliver the various goods that the customers have purchased on the website. They also have a online presence and a retail presence or a physical presence where they have about 100 physical shops in which people can come in and buy. And they also have kind of this bimodal sort of program where you can buy something online and have it delivered or picked up at a physical store. So they're really trying to innovate as much as they possibly can. Which is all really great. They've actually even talked about drones, having drone delivery, which is kind of a cool concept. I think with everything that's going on right now, I don't know. But in any case, I think it's a pretty interesting model for them. But when you look at kind of the way they're thinking about moving to the cloud and what they've already done, what their current operating model looks like, they actually have some pretty important constraints. And these are really important to kind of remember as we go through the rest of the content here, because these constraints are going to affect the kinds of decisions they can make about their landing zone. And effectively, what will end up happening is affect the way they go about their overall adoption of the cloud. So let's kind of walk through a couple of these here. There's actually more to it, and I'll talk a bit about that as we go. But the three most important ones are subscription democratization, application-centric service models, and policy-driven governance. So I'll walk through each one of these really quickly. So subscription democratization is actually something you really want to do when you have a landing zone, because that's essentially the best way to ensure that when you're consistently applying policy across your platform, but then you also allow for certain deviance with guardrails that allow for like different types of applications to run the way they need to. So with the governance, with the security, and with the management that is necessary for a particular type of workload or application. And so with subscription democratization, what you're effectively getting here is the ability for a production team a workload team to work with production systems. And the problem with Tailwind is they've never allowed their workload teams or business unit IT teams to work in production systems or touch production systems for that matter. In fact, their most innovative solution, an innovative team, has to go through an entire review process in order to actually have something to put in production. They have an architectural review, they have a test and design review, and then finally they have a production or a smoke test that they have to follow. So it's a pretty significant amount of work and overhead just to get into production. So with subscription democratization, this should help a lot. However, as I said, Tailwind probably can't go this direction because of their current processes. The next thing is application-centric service models, which are effectively the best way to think about migrating to the cloud. Because effectively what you're doing here is you're thinking about what applications do I need to move to the cloud versus which resources do I need to move to the cloud? If you're thinking about it from a resource perspective, which is actually something that probably Tailwind would do, they would be thinking about it from the perspective of how many VMs can I move to the cloud? They might not have any understanding of which of these VMs are affecting different applications. Like they could easily move over some VMs that were supporting an application on premise and now no longer support the application in the cloud. That could be a really bad performance issue or a reliability issue. All sorts of problems come from that. So, yep. Did you have anything you wanted?
Oh,
Okay.
hey, I would just say, like, yeah, that is a definite challenge. I'd say the other challenge is, when you're thinking about the application, you're also not thinking about the constraints of a type of resource.
Mm,
So if you have the opportunity to adopt instead of using a database server, to use a database service, right?
mhm.
Instead of using a identity server, to use an identity provider, or to use, a built-in SaaS offering, maybe a marketplace offering, right?
Right.
So when you do kind of constrain your application, you don't take an application centric approach. You lose some of the innovative approaches you can take with the cloud, the quicker iterative uh, in path that you can move with implementation, but also you lose some of the innovation that you would get with maybe adopting some of those newer services, because you don't have a full swatch, so to speak, of colors that you can pick from. You don't have as many options, right? So and that really affects. In some cases, it can affect cost of cloud adoption. In other cases, it's just limited to features.
Yeah. Given how much experience you've had with customers, have what are some of what are some of the issues you've seen from customers taking kind of a resource centric approach versus an application centric approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that number one, you have to be careful when you're adopting the cloud, not to the application dependency map for what are the dependent features that your application needs to move to the cloud, to be
Mm,
the recipe for what it will be in the cloud, right? So just because I have, for example, a virtual machine load balancer on prem, doesn't mean I need a full virtual machine to load balance to act as a quorum, and a listener service in the cloud.
mm,
There are potentially a list of other solutions that would provide me with that same functionality. So one of the things when you take that resource versus the application centric model is that you adopt old principles as the first step, and that can be a migration approach. Many times in consulting, we'll call it a phased approach. So you lift first, and then you optimize, and then you kind of move on to the next stage of what that application is going to look like and innovate. However, if you're moving to the cloud and you can do innovation while you move in your first migration, that means you get to those benefits of cost, you get to those benefits of features and functionalities sooner than if you take a phased approach, right? So that's the balance in deviation: is what is the most important business need, and am I investing in that business need most immediately, right? And so the other challenge that I see customers who take a resource specific approach is that they may have legacy operating systems or legacy functionality that limits them. So maybe they're using some type of Kerberos authentication and not modern authentication. And so they have to take that constraint with them to the cloud and say, okay, Kerberos authentication is mandatory for us. So when you take the resource specific approach, you find yourself in a very confined area of having to deal with cliff designs. And a cliff design typically is like a temporary solution in order to meet, a functional requirement right now, but it's going to prevent you from scale in the future.
mm,
And so those are the kind of things. And I think, each one of these deviances that you're calling out: subscription democratization, application centric service model, when we get through this one, and then, of course, policy driven governance. These are design principles. These are kind of principles that we use with the Azure Landing Zone approach. So we can kind of see now, from Tailwind traders, they have some deviation, which is fine, but they're choosing those investments at this time, at the time of their adoption, that's going to get them quickly to the cloud, number one, and number two, get their operating model up and executing.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point about they have to get up and move to the cloud quickly. So, how can they do that in a safe kind of seamless manner with that, while still keeping some of the things that, some of their legacy that they'll have to do for a while, because they are trying to move so quickly.
Mhm. Yeah, so that's this policy driven governance, right? Is that within the approach for Azure landing zones, we wanted to ensure that customers would define an approach with platform adoption for Azure, that they would have a compliance view of their environment from default, from standard, right? And so some customers, when we talk about adopting policy driven governance, they will adopt the Azure policies that we have for their landing zone, so that we can do some pretty intricate configurations of services by default. So when a new application team spins up a application landing zone, we can peer the virtual network from the application landing zone to the platform landing zone, thus providing them with corporate network connectivity going back to like an on-premise environment, right? So we can automate some of those things with policy, as well as drive the default configuration option for applications that require such access. But there is the now need for compliance and policy as code to be managed. And so some organizations don't have the headcount within their teams, and don't have the capability with infrastructure as code. So what you can do with Azure Landing Zone as well, instead of going so far as to configure those default services, those guardrails that we call them, with policy, you can simply audit them. All right.
Mhm.
So that gives you some visibility of where you want to go in the future, because it gives you the capability to understand where you're at right now. And so tailwinds in our case, in this scenario, and our customer here, they're going to deviate from the policy driven governance and having Azure policy implement configuration changes for them in their code promotion process, but they can still benefit from using those policies to effectively audit their configurations, right? So making no configuration changes, but understanding what you should change in your next cycle of innovation when it comes to securing, governing your landing zone.
Okay, fantastic. So we'll get more into that part of the discussion later in the session here. But I think it is really important to realize that you can come back. Like if you have a governance model in place, and you're not ready to move it to the cloud, or like with like management tools, or other things where you're not ready to give up those tools, mainly because maybe you have a skill set issue. Maybe and that's certainly an issue for Tailwind, is they just don't know how to go about operating in the cloud yet. So they're just dealing with some specific skilling issues, along with just understanding how to govern in the cloud in an effective manner. So, and again, we'll get back to it, but you don't have to do all of it right away. Like you don't have to make sure your governance model is in place. You can come back to it and enhance your landing zone as necessary. So yeah, let's move on and talk a little bit more about cloud operating models. So one of the things about the Tailwind's narrative is that they're a central IT organization. They have been from the get-go. Their CIO from before, he's now retired, and you have a new CIO in place, is basically saying, okay, we need to move to the cloud. We got to get rid of these data centers, but we have the central IT model. So is that enough? Is that adequate? And I think that's what we'll get to next. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And where they're finding themselves with a central IT model, right, is it's common for us to find customers that are even beyond the four examples and the four models that we have here. So each one of these models of cloud operating represents a journey that customers are on, where we find customers that have a decentralized model, where they have teams who are working on a individual operating size, where they're just thinking about the workload and the one thing that they need to execute, to where we see Tailwind traders with central IT operations, where, hey, they have a team that manages IT within their business, and that team that manages IT provides all the functionality and tries to provide a very smooth adoption of the cloud process, right? And they want to reduce friction. And then we have the enterprise operations model, which is where not only do you have central IT, but you also have specialization that starts at this phase. So now we have teams that work specifically on applications that have specialization on the platform on cloud. So if you kind of think about this in the concept of applications, let's think about some common needs that customers have. One example might be a internal system for tracking the books, right? Some type of internal ERP system, some type of internal system for tracking finances within the business. There's a specialized team that works on that workload. Maybe they work on building applications specifically on the framework that application, that ERP is built on. And then at the next level, you have a team that specializes in hosting that application on Azure in the cloud, right? And so you find that not only are there these singular teams that work on specific web applications, for example, but you also have teams that work on platform applications that utilize core platform components of the cloud as well as core platform within themselves and have applications that live within them. Another example of that would be AKS, right? Where you have you can create an entire multi-tenant environment within an Azure Kubernetes deployment and have multiple applications that reside within that application, right? And then the final sort of journey that we have in our models and our example is called distributed operations. And this is where really you see globally dispersed teams that have different execution models in different areas and in different regions, all based upon sovereignty requirements, based upon their IT footprint. And many times you'll see, like, for example, they may run central operations on their team that is located in the APAC region. And then in the Americas region of their business, they have a team that functions primarily as decentralized operations. They're mostly just managing web applications. So the distributed operations can be kind of a mix of different cloud operating models. And then there's one more that we're seeing start to take a prevailing wind and start to see customers move to, which is this idea around product-driven operating model. So this is where all of the operations within IT are aligned to delivery and management of application as products. And so this is kind of how we think about the different operating systems, but it all starts at some place. And I'd say that this first starting operating model, which is decentralized, is very, very basic, right? So within the context of tailwinds, they probably already have information technology teams that are managing individual workloads. You can think of this as something like, a WordPress deployment, or maybe potentially this is something like managing a wiki for internal tickets and knowledge, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, because they're so centralized and they're so locked down, if they have something like this, it's probably shadow IT going on. Like there probably is some team out there that's just kind of building their own stuff, probably already in the cloud because everything is centralized and locked down already. So if this is going on, this is probably something the CIO probably doesn't know about.
Right, and I think that decentralized approach can exist even within centralized operations, and it's entirely important, and that's why we kind of show this maturity to centralized operations, because that's where the landing zone starts to make sense. That no matter, regardless of what stage you are in the cloud operating model, is that you want that common configuration. So when you, whether you're centralized or whether you're decentralized or moving to enterprise operations, you're going to see that what happens is these standard configurations and reporting that you want across these different operating models becomes even more important. And so central IT needs a function by which they can audit and understand what is in the cloud, assess, and monitor and track those assets and resources that are being deployed and what their relationship is to each other. And so this centralized operations model for tailwinds is what they primarily govern by. And if there may be a shadow IT that's going on with individual applications, but I think they have a desire to have that full visibility of what's in the cloud.
So just from your street knowledge, like when you've gone out to different customers and thinking about how they want to adopt the cloud, like where are they typically when they start talking to you, and where do they end up? Like where do they end up? Like do they become kind of the centralized? Do they stick with the centralized model, or do they move to something else?
Most customers that I talk to are in any of the four phases or any like half step in between them, right? So one of the important things that I think about with any of the cloud operating models is that uh, for a customer, their foundation in the cloud and what's needed for them is based upon how their business is organized and how they need to deliver value. That's the value stream alignment part. So you find customers who are centralized that may be halfway in the boat between centralized operating model and the enterprise operating model, where they're starting to have specialized storage and specialized database teams that are taking over management of these applications or of application groups as a whole. So no longer did you have just a simple workload team that had a database administrator inside of it. Now you have a set of database administrators that they work as a team, maybe covering different time zones to manage all of the databases for all the applications within the business. And so customers typically are onboarding or moving to any different cloud operating model based upon what their organization structure looks like, what their value stream looks like, and also what their relationship is, and if they have a cloud center of excellence. So many times we talk about the cloud center of excellence as being a team that can ensure standards and practices for cloud adoption are being followed, that can ensure that cost and tracking as far as FinOps is being executed so the business understands where they're making those investments, right? And then you typically have an enablement team that is, they are trained cloud solution architects who are ready and available to help product teams as they move their applications to the cloud or have any mixture of application that coexists between on-premises and cloud, and really understand hybrid architecture to help facilitate and manage those applications. And the last part of the CCOE is that platform engineer team. The platform engineer team makes standards of templates and practices or catalogs of automation that are adopted by workload teams, thereby ensuring that the proper governance and cost and tagging controls are all in place by default with that catalog of automation that they manage and create for the entire business. So the CCOE plays a large role in which operating model a customer may be in, but they could find themselves in on any stage of the sort of cloud operating models that we've defined, or half stage where they're in between, and trying to move to a different stage based upon what the business objectives are. But definitely, we do see that kind of product-driven approach where focusing on giving as much autonomy, it provides the most scale for businesses.
So that's very interesting. And I'm looking at the slide. There's a really interesting square here. The foundation utilities between the middle cloud and the right-hand cloud. I think it's right-hand. Not sure which perspective we're looking at here, but where you've got the landing zone where the central IT, it seems like, and then you've got the decentralized, or sorry, the operation, the enterprise operations, where foundational utilities is on top of the landing zone, and then you have foundational utilities in the platform foundation. Why is that? Why is there that transition there?
So what you'll see is that in enterprise IT, moving to decentralized IT and moving into like product-driven operational model, is that there are shared services. Networking is a great example of a shared service. You need networking at the core of your business to drive connectivity between line of business teams. You need networking at the level of the application in order to connect features and functionality and maybe different tiers of your application, as well as interact with other applications in a microservices architecture. And then another example of shared services is with identity, where you need different types of identity for different applications, right? So these foundational utilities, whether it be networking or identity, or it could also be a foundational utility can be a database administrator, right? It's like managing all of these databases. What we see is that the adoption of these foundational utilities, as you move in the cloud operating model up to a more decentralized fabric of cloud operations and IT value stream alignment, is that those configurations become more default across the business, meaning we know that our mission critical applications should have by default zonally aware databases. and they should have redundancies in more than one region. And so what happens is that in this transition, you see the foundational utilities in the shared services team that are typically run from workload requirements become more platform requirements, because we need high availability on on our mission critical applications. And so these become default configurations that now are adopted through automation, where these best practices, one of the things that we often talk about with compute, with virtual machines, is ensuring that your VMs are run in zones, right? In Azure, in our zones, availability zones. And so the platform foundations team and with these foundational utilities would ensure that when deployments happen with infrastructure as code for a VM, for example, that the default configuration is to be in at least a minimum, maybe it would be 2 zones. So that's the kind of transition that happens between centralized IT and enterprise IT to decentralized IT, is that you see more of the business requirements for the configurations of all cloud adoption need to be followed. Because when you start getting into, for example, security control compliance for NIST, for ISO, you need to have that compliance across all workloads, across specific applications. And so you start to see this configuration happen for foundational utilities at the base of the business.
Okay, very interesting. So are you ready to move to the next slide?
Yes. So it really comes down to aligning the foundation in the appropriate context. So we'll talk about this in with respect to environmental complexity, right? So much of what we talked about just now was about how you move with your shared services management and with your team as your infrastructure technology, or that level of your support team that manages the cloud adoption. As you move to a more diverse team and your team grows and your adoption of cloud, the portfolio that you manage grows, then you're gonna increase environmental complexity, and you're gonna need that level of foundational management for your cloud environment. And so this is where we say, like, you have to find the right operating model that fits your requirements, right? And so when we look at decentralized operations, each one has pros and cons, but it's about what matches your business objectives. You can see decentralized operations provides with a lot of innovation, as well as workload and workload teams being able to deploy quickly. But many times the customer can not only think about what they're deploying, but also the security and the governance that needs to go around that. So when we move into central operations, we see more control being established, as well as landing zones and central IT team that's managing different parts of those shared services, like we talked about with networking and with identity and with security. And then as we move into enterprise operations, we start to see democratization become more important. So we start to see those standards for the operations of the platform, those foundational services being defined as infrastructure as code and pushed out across the cloud excellence team to all applications and adopted as part of the cloud platform adoption process. And then with distributed operations, we start to see this integration happen between different areas and different business segments to manage their complex portfolio, and they mix different cloud operating models based upon their business requirements.
So distributed operations, that seems like something that a lot of customers, large customers, would have. It seems like that would be a situation they're in often. So are they ever trying to move towards a more simple model? It would seem like that would be a good idea, but is that possible?
I think, yeah, it's always possible. I've worked with several customers in the last year who were in different stages of their cloud operating model, but mostly at this distributed operations level, you will always have a cloud center of excellence. And so what happens with the customer as far as where they are with their cloud operating model and the distributed operations and what's more appropriate for what area of business has to do with what the cloud center of center of excellence's objectives are for those business units, right? So maybe there's a desire for to provide more flexibility with cloud adoption, right, and to ease the process for application teams to adopt the cloud. And so that may be a constraint in some business units, but not in other business units. So the CCOE has to decide, okay, where do we put our priorities with doing this for all business units or just for the single business unit that needs this investment? Another good example is with cost tracking. Different segments of the business, different business, maybe line of business applications may do cost tracking more or less maturely than those businesses that have been in the cloud for a while. And so the cloud center of excellence is really around finding the baseline for all of the business units and all the subsidiaries, and then trying to ensure that you see that that at least the standard level of adoption across the board, and then driving those priorities. So primarily, once you get to distributed operations, what drives the change in enterprise or centralized management tactics, or even product-driven management tactics, it comes down to what are the objectives of the CCOE and their ability to track and measure and observe those key horizon goals that they need to achieve for the business. And so that could be, increasing cloud adoption through automation. It could be increasing visibility to control costs, so that you implement tags. You can see, across your environment what your cost posture looks like. And then I think the final one that I see the most with CCOE, right, as we talk about scale, is cloud enablement. So this comes down to helping application teams understand how to use innovation in the cloud. So you may have an application team who understands some of the services of Azure, but maybe they don't understand how Redis Cache could help their application. That's where the enablement team and that cloud solution architect with a lot of experience can come in and say, hey, this is where Redis Cache fits into your application, how we can, expedite, reduce time for caching, for example.
All right, so there's a good question that came from the team, or from the audience here, and it actually was something I was going to ask anyway. So when someone says democratization, we used the term earlier, subscription democratization. What is it exactly when we say democratization, and how is it used in design, especially when you think about you're bringing over an application, or you're migrating an application, or you're just trying to manage something? How does democratization work?
Yeah, so I think we are going to talk about this, and let's go ahead and talk about it now, which is around these principles for your cloud adoption. And democratization, we want to think about in the concepts of Azure Landing Zone as providing the unit of management and unit of scale that an application team would need when they want it, right? So we want to democratize the application team's ability to get environments to host their applications. So what that means by democratizing it means we want to make it so that it's very easy for all teams to be in alignment and agree. So, sort of like the play on the word democracy, we want to ensure that the central IT administrators, as well as the application teams, have an agreement on what configuration should be true for a Azure subscription. And we want to allow the application team to consume them as they need, knowing that they will be secure by default, they will have networking by default, and they will have identity by default that meets our regulatory compliance. So this idea around democratization has to do with, typically Azure subscriptions are used as units of scale. Each one comes with a quota limit, as well as they come with management overhead, right? So we need to log those things that are within it. So when you think about democratization, we're talking about allowing a company to adopt Azure or Azure subscriptions as quickly as teams need them in order to innovate, and doing so in a secure and timely fashion.
So for a subscription, or let's say it differently, for a workload, would you have like one subscription per workload, or how would you think about this? Like, what's a ratio look like?
I wish it was as easy as Pythagoras theorem, or a squared, b squared, c squared. Look, yeah. It comes down to this, right? When we talk about an application, the reason why we focused on the principle of application-centric model is whether an application needs one subscription or it needs 3 or 4 subscriptions, that's based upon the quota limits for the service itself, right? So if you look within Azure, each subscription has a certain amount of quota limit for different resources, right? And so you may find that hosting an application across 3 or 4 applications is right for that application, or you may find that you can host a application in a single subscription or a group of applications in a single subscription. It comes down to defining what those requirements are for your application and what the quota limits are for that subscription. And that is precisely the point and the objective of subscription democratization, because you have and you have researched what the limits of that subscription are, and you can properly scale your application centric approach to how many subscriptions you need. So instead of, is it right to just put one application and one subscription, it becomes, let's do the right thing for the application, and whether it be one subscription or 4 subscriptions, we now have the appropriate amount.
Okay. That makes sense. And yeah, and so Santosh, thanks very much for prompting that question. It was a really good one. All right, so are you ready to move on to the next slide?
Time for a knowledge check. Knowledge check.
Oh, there we go. All right, fair enough. Let's get into it. Okay, so I'll kind of walk through the question here, and let's kind of walk through like each of these answer choices and see what everyone comes up with. So, which of the following answers best describes the operating model at Tailwind Traders? What is your thinking? Do you think I kind of think, and we've been kind of saying it, it's probably centralized operations, but they could have a little bit of decentralized operations in there. Or distributed operations for that matter. What do you think? All right. Well, let's see what the answer is. I think it's probably centralized operations, but I'm I'm kind of leading the witness here. All right. Perfect. All right. So there we go. And so why do you think it's centralized operations? All right, I'll go ahead and answer that question then. I think it's centralized operations because one, they've already determined that they're not going to move their governance model away from what they're currently doing. So they're going to continue using their central IT operations. Their their operating model is going to stay as a central IT operations, and which is fine. It's something they have to do to start moving to the cloud. They have a bunch of things that they're trying to accomplish, and they don't have the skill sets ready to take on a more enterprise-like approach. So I think that's probably the number one thing, that the reason why they're still in a centralized operations mode. But they have a lot of applications to migrate. They have like 1,200 applications or workloads to move over in the next 18 to 24 months. So it makes sense that they want to keep with their existing structure, because they just have to move quickly. So, all right, let's move on to number 2. So in the customer narrative, there is a controlled process for release of the solutions that come from the retail innovation team. If that process improves to allow that team to manage its own workloads in a controlled landing zone, which operating model would best describe the new arrangement? So I kind of let on a little bit of what this was about. So their retail innovation team basically has they're all about innovation, and what they do is they develop, they build, and they release. However, what they need to do is go through this architectural review program or process, like I mentioned earlier. And now what if they're able to move away from that and actually be able to go democratize and own their own service or their own subscription, but with the guardrails around it, then they'll end up having a different model, which is again great for them. So which one do we think this would be, this new model for them?
The interesting thing for me on this one, Ben, is that if we think about the areas where tailwinds deviated, it kind of leads them to where they want to go in the cloud operating model as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so they're going to end up evolving this direction anyway. So over time, they're going to maybe do it right away, or they're going to do all the applications right away, or they're going to just evolve, and that's kind of what we're going to see here. So if they have their own guardrails, like if they're doing it themselves, it's going to be a different answer than if there's guardrails that are applied to all applications or all workloads. So that's an important part to this. There you go. So because that we're talking about guardrails that are managed by all workloads, it's going to be an enterprise operations sort of scenario. Now, if they had their own guardrails, if they're doing their own management, then it would be a decentralized operations. All right, thanks very much. All right, let's. Okay, we got, I think, one or two more to go. So retail innovation team was entirely workload focused before tailwind traders acquired it. Based on what you know, what operating model best describes how that team operated before the acquisition? Okay, I kind of let the cat out of the bag on the last one, so let's go ahead and just let people know what they are. Yeah, there you go. It's a decentralized operations model. Okay. All right, I think we have one more to go. Nope, we're on to design areas. Okay.
Yes, we're going to talk about design areas next.
Okay. So deploying a landing zone is a really, it's a big step in your adoption, but there's a bunch of things you need to think about beforehand. One is just figuring out what sort of cloud environment you need for your operating model. So let's talk a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, Ben, I think this is where we talked about, when we talk about Azure Landing Zone principles, that is the approach by which Azure Landing Zone architecture was developed and was iterated upon in order to come up with what the resource organization looks like and what features and functionality it should have. The design areas are how a customer should think about designing their landing zone, right? So once we have laid our principles in place and we know that we want to see subscription democratization, we want to have policy as guardrails, we want to follow an application-centric approach, right? We want to have a central control plane where we're managing all the operations. Once we've come up with those principles, then we say, okay, what are each one of the areas that we would need to design for when it comes to adopting the Azure platform? And what it kind of equates to is that there are environmental design areas that are very much specific to the Azure platform, and they should have a default kind of level of investment configuration that's common, we believe, for most customers. And then there is a compliance set of design areas, and those are vary in how deeply a customer would go into configuring security, governance, management, platform automation, and DevOps, right? So the environmental design areas are more default configuration structure within, we believe, a common set of what customers should adopt. Compliance becomes more tricky where, yes, there should be some default security, obviously secure by default, but at the same time, certain customers, based upon their industry, based upon their compliance requirements, they're going to invest more deeply into security and governance and management and DevOps and automation than other customers, right? And so there's almost like a level of intensity on the compliance design areas in which a customer would invest.
So is there a level, like is there a baseline that everyone should follow? Like when you talk about security or you talk about governance and management?
Yeah, there absolutely is. I think that when we look at the design principles, then the design areas start to stand out as what the default should be, right? It's like when we talk about the design principles from a standpoint of subscription democratization, that means that we must have a baseline for what a good structure of resources looks like within the Azure tenant. So in order to properly provide subscription democratization as units of autonomy and innovation, we need to have a basic structure of management groups. We need to have a basic structure of Azure policies that we put in place for subscriptions that are going to be implemented at will at the application team. The same thing is true when we talk about policy being on those management groups. The policy-driven governance, those Azure policies that are on those management groups, ensure that the configurations for our business that are default for those different application types happen at the same time when the subscription is implemented. So what that means is that if we deploy a subscription for a new application team, based upon whether or not that application is going to be connected to our corporate network, or it's going to be an online only application that only needs connectivity within its own internal network, no external communications, either could be out publicly to the internet facing or internally within itself. Those are different requirements. And we can put the policies in place to make that configuration by default so that we have the security, we have the governance, right? We have the observability into that environment. So these design principles inform the design areas and the investment that we need to make for each one of those critical areas, right? So if we look at the common implementation approach, each customer is going to look at an Azure landing zone design area, and they're going to design the landing zone, if they take a custom approach, to meet their own requirements. They're going to say, what investment do I need from an Azure billing and Active Directory perspective? What investment do I need from an identity and access management perspective? And we provide default guidance and recommendations on what we believe a customer should do and what those defaults should be. We also provide reference implementations or automation on those, but oftentimes customers are taking an iterative approach where they're looking at a design area to help them understand how to design for billing and Active Directory. They're following our recommendations as much as they can. And then they're going to come back and they'll have this iterative check and small implementations where they're going to implement and make these changes over time. So whether a customer is starting or whether a customer already has resources in their Azure environment, the design areas will always be an important place for customers to visit and a check for the most recent recommendations for their landing zone.
Okay, so if we take Tailwind, for instance, and they're saying basically they can't do much with their governance. They really don't want to make many changes to their management operations. And there's a certain security baseline they understand, but they can't go much further than that for now. And so what they've basically said is we just need to deploy the minimum. So which of these boxes here should they be checking? And how do they go about doing that? You're probably going to show this in the next slide. But so that's one question. The other question is, when you just showed this on the right hand side, this very complex looking architecture, is that something that everyone has to follow right away, or what's the general approach here, or the general thought?
Yeah, so the architecture on the right really isn't as complex as it looks, right? We have customers across many different segments that look at the architecture, and you have to kind of you have to know what how to organize your resources, and so that's why the kind of diagram has a call out and so much definition in it, is because we want customers to know why the resources are organized the way that they are. So we got very, very much into the detail on that Visio. And it's also a downloadable artifact that customers pick up and customize all the time. So with that being said, the actual landing zone implementation varies in size based upon the customer's requirements for the amount of subscriptions that they need for their applications, as well as the amount of connectivity that they need and each one of the design areas, the investment that they need in each one of those. So if governance is not a high priority and for the customer, or is something that is a deviant for their investment for their business, then that's certainly something that they can customize in the configuration itself. So when we actually go and we show in a few minutes how to implement Azure landing zones with the portal accelerator, we'll take a look at that and see what that looks like. So I think this is important to talk about in the context of Tailwind, is that they do have some deviations in their design, right? And how they've deviated from the principles. And one of those is what we've talked about is subscription democratization. So we believe, in Azure landing zones, that we should use these subscriptions as a unit of mail, as a unit of management, and scale to accelerate application migrations and innovation. And so that by not following this and deviating from subscription democratization, there is some impact here. The customer is going to have to manage much more granularly their code promotion process and their infrastructure as code when it comes to those compliance and security configurations, as well as the central operations team will need to come up with a way to audit their environment, because they won't have the policies to audit the default configurations for them. So this is kind of the impact of deviating from from the subscription democratization, is that, okay, without subscription democratization, every application team needs a custom approach to their subscription requirements and the deployment of it.
Hmm. It's and I'll ask this question as we go further down. But one of the things that is interesting about the reference architecture as it is it basically is showing everything you need. It's like it's that North Star. It's basically the thing that says, if you were to implement all these different features or all these different concepts, you're going to be able to essentially adopt the cloud in a best practices manner. This is effectively aligning to the cloud adoption framework. And so when you get going on the demo, so just kind of put this in the back of your head, is which of these are like, are all these aspects, all these design principles a part of the design of the accelerator, or just some pieces of it?
Yeah, so
And
let's take a look at it. When we look at the conceptual architecture, the Azure Landing Zone accelerators, we have one for portal experience, one for the Bicep experience, and one for the Terraform experience. They all use the same architectural design and implement the same resources. So in many ways, we want to ensure that customers have these default best practices, exactly like what you called out. So whether a customer is deviating from any of the different policy-driven governance recommendation, or if it necessarily is application-centric service model, it doesn't really matter if they are deviating on what type of automation they can use, because whether it be Portal or Bicep or Terraform, we can customize those, based upon what the customer's requirement is. So as far as when it comes to the customer's journey to the target architecture, and where we see them as kind of starting their process of a cloud adoption, right? So you're getting ready, and now it's like ready, set, go. Start, align, and enhance with your landing zone. You start with, as a customer who's in what we typically would say is a greenfield customer who has a net new Azure tenant, and so they don't have any existing landing zone design areas implemented into their environment. A align customer who's in the line stage probably already has some components of those foundational services, those shared services that we talked about in landing zones implemented into their Azure tenant. And so in the align stage, we're helping the customer to align to the Azure landing zone design areas and those recommendations that are by default in our implementation options, and also making sure that the customer is moving towards that path of alignment. And then you have customers who are in this last stage, which is enhanced. And so a customer who's in the enhanced stage has probably already got a landing zone that's in alignment with Azure landing zones. And so from that perspective, all of the recommendations from the cloud adoption framework are being followed. And so now it's about enhancing the investments that customers made. So let's talk about that, like specifically to each stage. So a customer who's starting typically a brand new environment, exploring the design areas, starting to plan out their build, they're ready to start, right? A customer who's ready to align has this existing environment, but they want to change some part of the configuration. One of the design areas, identity, networking, one of them they want to align on, and they want to start working through each design area to align further to our best recommendations and our best practices. And then you have customers who are like really interested in enhancing because they already have alignment to the Azure landing zones architecture that we were reviewing. And so they want to invest more in security or one of the compliance design areas typically.
Okay, so that's very interesting. And so when you look at the conceptual architecture and the landing zone accelerator, how much of the reference architecture is actually deployed as part of that landing zone architecture?
It really depends on the customer's requirements, right? So when a customer starts from scratch, the customer who's going to start, they're going to need to create some platform subscriptions.
Mhm.
And those platform subscriptions are going to host typically those shared services, those foundational services that we spoke about earlier.
Mhm.
Then once they've done that, they're going to move to creating their platform configuration for their resources. So they can either deploy one of three of the platform accelerators for ALZ. So we have the portal accelerator, which is a portal experience for customers who don't have infrastructure as code capability. And then we have ALZ, Azure Landing Zone Bicep, and Terraform modules for customers who are familiar with either of those infrastructure as code languages. So once you have your subscriptions created, then you can implement the platform by using one of our accelerators. And then you start creating application landing zones and vending application landing zones. This is this landing zone vending module that's here in infrastructure as code as examples. And then you start deploying workloads. So this is common. This is the common journey from a technical perspective, from sort of a level 400 of what the customer would do when implementing their subscriptions. First, you set up those platform subscriptions. Second, you create the platform and actually organize your resources within your tenant environment. Third, you start vending those subscriptions that are needed for application teams. And then application teams start deploying those workloads. And at this very first stage, once you have your subscriptions defined, you're going to create your platform. And so that's where we can really look, Ben, at what it would look like for a customer who is going through and doing this in the portal themselves. I want to deploy Azure Landing Zones. I don't have infrastructure as code capability. What does that look like for me, right? So this is typically the first place we start.
Okay. So when is it possible just to blow it up a little bit? It's kind of hard to see a little. There you go. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. So when the customer starts, you'll see the first thing we're asking here is their cloud, the Azure's cloud environment, right? So many customers use our commercial cloud. They also may be looking at US Gov or China Cloud. And so the first thing we're going to ask them is to select what their cloud environment type is. Second, we're going to define a directory. In this case, I'm using my customer success account. This is one that we use for demos. And then I'm going to select my region. This region is where my tenant or my tenant level deployment for my landing zone is going to go. So once I've selected these three options, I'm going to go to the next page, which is called Azure Core Setup. In Azure Core Setup, I'm going to define what the name of my root prefix for my management group should be. So in this case, you can see some that I've saved here. I'm going to go with Contoso. In this model, I've got a couple of options. Am I going to deploy with a dedicated subscriptions for each one of my shared services? So like, for example, in ALZ, we have a identity subscription, a connectivity subscription, and a management subscription. That's my preferred model. I like to have separate subscriptions for each one of those sort of shared services that are going to be common across each one of the workloads that I bring to the cloud. We also have an option here for whether you want to prevent classic resources, right? So we have some Azure classic resources that are available, but really they're considered legacy. Maybe a customer needs them, maybe doesn't. We give them kind of the option to decide whether or not those should be allowed to be deployed. And then finally, those virtual machine scale sets and unmanaged disks, right? We believe it's a best practice that customers use managed disks and that they're would use something like Azure availability zones versus using scale sets. So you can kind of prevent some of these things by default in your configuration. This is that foundational, CCOE level. I want to ensure this is true across my entire cloud environment sort of configurations. And then we have a bit of telemetry that we enable.
Can I ask a quick question about the dedicated subscription up there? One of the things I remember seeing in the Learn module was that because Tailwinds was thinking about not utilizing some of the services like management or governance, for instance, that if they wanted to come back and use it, they probably should have a dedicated subscription here, because otherwise they're going to end up having to kind of roll back and refactor the landing zone to a degree. So can you explain why that is? What happens if you were to select a single subscription versus a dedicated subscription?
Yeah, so if you select dedicated, you're going to get separate subscriptions for connectivity, for your identity, for management, and then you can choose an optional landing zone subscription. We do separate subscriptions because it gives you less of a cliff design where you run into the subscription limits or design limitations in your architecture. What can happen is if you deploy into a single subscription, we select this option here. What'll happen is you'll deploy all of your connectivity management and identity components into a single subscription, which means at a later date, you're going to need to refactor and move those out if you get a certain amount of scale, right? So we believe as a best practice, it's recommended that you start with dedicated because it's going to give you a configuration by default that you're going to be able to start, won't incur a lot of management overhead, and be able to scale, won't have a cliff design. Versus if you go down the single route, then yes, you can do this if you think you're never going to grow out of this level of management. But know that when you do, you will need to address that, right? So you will have to, you will have to build out your additional identity and management and connectivity subscriptions, and then migrate your resources if you don't deploy it in the beginning as a dedicated.
Yeah, and I think another really interesting problem here, and this was a question that was just brought up, was around liability reduction. So, like, isn't it one of the another really good idea is to like basically increase the surface area of your landing zone so that if there is some sort of breach, for instance, it doesn't take down your entire subscription or your entire landing zone.
Yeah, correct. Absolutely. So when we move on from the Azure core setup to platform management, security, and governance, this is where we're going to start to select the policies that we want to put in place that will deploy default configurations as well as deny configurations that are less secure. So we're going to enforce that Key Vault has the recommended guardrails on it. We're going to go ahead and ensure that our log analytics workspace that will collect all logs, centralized logs from our Azure tenant, is implemented, and it has the default 30-day retention, which we can get up to 730 days there as whatever our business requirements may be. And then when we look at our management subscription, which will select our management subscription here, we can then say, okay, for a management subscription, we want to ensure that our agent health solution, all of our VM Insight solutions, these are deployed by default to give us that level of reducing liability and risk, because we have by default, we have some security baseline as well as an informational baseline. So when we deploy Defender for Cloud, we know what email we should use in order to send notifications to an individual of what alerts are happening with Defender as far as virus control or certain servers that need attention. So these are all default configurations for the platform that we ensure to reduce liability, as well as to ensure that there is a basic level of visibility and security and asset tracking in the tenant itself, right? And this continues when we get to baseline alerts and monitoring, that we have the default configuration.
Sorry, I have another question for you.
Yeah.
So one of the things that Tailwinds said in the case study was that they're planning to use their own management tools. So they've been using System Center Operations Manager. They plan to continue to use that. They also have some other third-party tools. So can they use log analytics in this manner, or like what sort of operations should they expect if they're going to what can they configure now?
Yeah. Well, I think a good aspect is that, like, for example, what SCOM can do versus what we can do in the cloud is like reporting on connectivity configurations. You want to leave that on, as well as identity with Azure AD. But when it comes to management, maybe just for the VMs that you're implementing, you would turn this baseline alert off, as well as there may be some other alerts that you would want to turn off because you're getting them from System Center Operations Manager or one of those different System Center products, right? So you do get the granularity, and that goes back to even like our governance controls here for if you want to deploy certain solutions, right? So VM Insights, maybe you're going to just use the VM Insights that comes from System Center. I think that for the platform, there are integrations between System Center and what we do in Azure by default. And you do have some options to kind of customize and tailor this. And that's really the power here, is that based upon what deviations your customer is in, you're going to have that simplification to customize those default configurations here in the portal. Now, for customers who require more complex customization, Then obviously there's going to be the Azure landing zones bicep implementation. And so in the
Mhm.
bicep implementation, we have modules for each level of diagnostics and hub configuration for your network. And so you'll be able to customize your infrastructure as code for your deployment. And the same thing is true for Terraform. So with our Terraform module, you'll be able to work through the registry for HashiCorp and be able to customize with the modules that we have for Terraform any configuration that you're needed to in order to really meet the maturity level that you are at with your business.
Okay, wow. Yeah, so there's a lot here. I went through the Terraform registry a while back, and I think there was something like 300 different modules. Is so what do you think? Are all those modules quote unquote safe? Are there any that Microsoft like certifies or suggests using, or what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great call out. What I'd say is that in the Azure landing zone content itself, there's a couple of resources that can help customers. The first thing is like really understanding where you should invest. So we have an Azure landing zone review assessment where you can go through and by design area, you can get kind of our default recommendations and best practices. The second thing is around like, okay, what implementation options are out there and should I use based upon my skill set? We do have implementation options called out with Bicep and Terraform, and then they link to the Azure Architecture Center where you can get step-by-step instructions for the Bicep landing zone as well as the Terraform landing zone implementations. And
Mhm.
and so you can go here and see the actual modules that we're using to ensure that you're using the correct Terraform modules that we call out in our implementations. But when it comes to like true deployment options, I would go to the landing zone deployment options page. If you go onto this page and visit any of the cloud operating model platform landing zone accelerators or our application landing zone accelerators, these are all a great starting point and a key place where you can know that these assets and what are in these libraries are reviewed, signed off, approved, Microsoft components, right? Because you can go and you get many things published in the Terraform registry, and that's a great resource for open source tooling. This is where we kind of have built out our library of available resources.
Okay. And I suppose there's, like I see here, there's the application. If you clicked on one of these links, it would take you to that accelerator, which is in the architecture center, and it has lots of information about each one of these accelerators. So like you could actually come in and really see how the deployment is or how the architecture works, and why some of the guidance was given as it is. So
Yeah, so we go right here into the AKS accelerator, and then we can look at the design area for network topology and
yeah,
see what design considerations for networking with AKS we should review for our workload.
fantastic. Okay, we only have a few minutes left. Let's see where we're at, and if we're gonna get even close to our the
Yeah.
end of the slides here.
So we've gone through an army of slides. I think we've done a good job on our landing zone options and talking through the implementation approaches when it comes to tailwinds.
Mhm.
I think that one of the areas that we really want to be able to, I'm going to skip some of these, is getting to our knowledge check
Mm.
for the implementation options that we just reviewed. So this is a question around which implementation options should Tailwind traders use, right?
Mm.
Do they have an infrastructure as code capability? Do they specifically have was anything shared in the description about them as having the capability for Bicep or Terraform in our customer scenario?
Well, I also think it's an interesting question about, if they were to deploy the landing zone accelerators as it is, um, would that be the right option, or should they actually think about a more customized approach, especially if it's they're kind of looking for a cut down version of the overall architecture, reference architecture. Uh, my thinking is that they would probably want not something as grandiose as choice A, um, and therefore maybe choice B or choice C. But then I'm not sure. I'm not sure if B or C is which one is better here. Um, I think, tell me if you're what you think. But I think probably using Bicep, because isn't that it's a declarative language that is meant to basically help a new person understand how to deploy a module like this. Uh, oh, look at that. I was
Yeah.
completely wrong.
Yeah. I think that, the first thing is that even with the deviations that they have, they didn't call it any clear place, right? With where they
Right,
had the DevOps experience on the platform versus their application teams had a lot of DevOps experience. So they need
right.
those workflows to be deployed. But for their platform landing zone, none of the deviations that they outlined were not, all of the changes that they need to make were uh, accomplishable via the portal and the Azure Landing Zone Accelerator. So that was the option there.
Fantastic.
Now I think this is probably where you are getting to.
Ah, uh-huh.
What
Okay.
would be the better starting point? And
Okay. Darn it.
I think
Um,
you nailed that one.
well, but I guess I still have a question about that. Why choose Bicep over Terraform? Especially if you have like, yeah, why would you do that?
I think the key here is that the with Tailwind traders, right, is that Bicep with respect to their platform starting, they had no previous knowledge of Terraform. Most
Mm,
customers that I see who want to implement Terraform, they already are using Terraform, and so they want to implement it, or they already have Terraform implemented in another cloud provider. I think with Tailwind, they're a new business. They're starting with Azure. They don't have a multi-cloud strategy. This is Azure is their preferred cloud of choice, and so Bicep is the one that they have chosen to invest in.
okay. Okay, makes sense.
So we kind of reviewed the accelerators. In fact, we walked through and did an implementation. But for customers who, the implementation of Azure Landing Zones is something they've been doing for a while, we talked about that third and final stage, which is enhancing your landing zone. And this has been where this connectivity tissue between, I think, this session
Mm,
and the session that you're doing next starts to
mm,
kick off, which is you have your landing zone in place, but now you want to enhance the foundational services that you have in place for your platform.
mm. Okay. So when you talk about governance management security, to me this sounds like optimization. Like this is when we think about the definition of optimization, you would break it down into these three different areas. And so there's a lot of people think of optimization as being just around cost. Uh, but this looks like it's also taking into the notion of technical optimization. And so could you walk through kind of what we're thinking about here? Like,
Yeah.
what is this connective tissue you're referring to?
Yeah, yeah. So the kind of the likeness here is that with a platform and with your adoption of landing zone, the work will never be complete. You're
Mm,
always going to be doing improvements. Anything in the cloud is always going to be there's going to be improvements. There's going to be iteration that's going to be need to be done. The same thing is true for workloads. Workloads continuously their life cycle will either be retired or updated, or they'll be refactored right into a new state. And so we're commonly going to invest at differing levels on governance, management, and security across not only our portfolio of IT, but singularly on a specific application. So when
mm,
we start to expand out of the platform landing zone and start talking about application landing zones, you're going to see more investment on how we govern groups of applications, or what we would call platform applications. So these are services like AKS that provide a further platform. Another example would be SAP provides a platform for applications. These need their own governance model that overarches. So what I mean by that is that yes, you have default governance that happens at the platform level of Azure, but now you have governance that also applies within the application itself. The same
mm,
thing is true for manage. With
mm.
you are managing an environment, you're going to have a broad level of management at the platform level, but then also at the application level, you have to make sure that you have metrics in place and tracking for your costs so that you really understand what performance level you're getting from that application. And the same thing is true with security. Having security at just the platform level leaves you vulnerable at the application level, and having security at the application level only leaves the platform as a whole vulnerable. So you need to think about the complete framework.
Okay. So we'll get to that, the next level, that application level in the next session, when we talk about the well-architected framework. Uh, is there anything else we want to cover? We're just kind of finishing up here. Anything else we should just kind of close out with?
Yeah, I think we definitely want to let people know what are the next steps, right?
Mm.
So obviously in the Learn module, going through each section that's there, we have a lot of the interactive Learn module. But hey, get set up for that next session.
Yep, yep. And we'll see you in the next session. David Blank Edelman and Sarah Kong is gonna. Sarah was my host in the last one, so the two of them are gonna go at it, and I'll be your moderator. So bring your questions. Thanks, everybody.